Here is something we have not told you yet. Something that changes everything about how you should understand the death of Eric Butler. Investigators have linked the Grundy crew to over 20 unsolved murders in Indianapolis. 20. And not a single member of that organization was ever convicted of homicide. Not one. Every murder case collapsed. Witnesses lied. Evidence disappeared. Charges were dropped. The bodies stayed in the ground, and the killers stayed on the street. And Eric Butler, Lil E, was a high-ranking member of that organization who not only survived the collapse of the crew, but beat 2 major criminal cases afterward and walked free, right back onto the same East Side streets where 20 bodies were buried and nobody was ever held accountable. Now he's the 21st. This is Mystora crimes. And tonight, we go somewhere we haven't gone before, because this is not just a story about one man's death. This is a story about an organization that was supposed to be dead and isn't, a body count that was supposed to have answers and doesn't, a man who was being watched with federal money while simultaneously chasing the biggest opportunity of his life, and a pattern of violence that has been repeating itself on the east side of Indianapolis for over a decade, killing people who the courts decided weren't worth convicting anyone over. Everything tonight is built on what came before. And subscribe, turn the bell on, because what we're about to show you is the piece of this story that nobody else has connected. Let's go. Let's start with a number that should make your blood run cold. Over 20 unsolved murders. That is what investigators told Fox 59 were potentially connected to the Grundy crew's activity in Indianapolis. Over 20 people killed. And the Marion County Prosecutor's Office admitted publicly, openly on the record, that despite years of trying, they never convicted a single member of the Grundy family or the Grundy crew of murder. Not one conviction. Not one person behind bars for any of those deaths. Every case either collapsed, got dismissed, or never made a trial at all. Think about what that means structurally, not emotionally. Structurally, it means that everyone in and around that organization, everyone who watched those killings happen, everyone who knew who ordered them, everyone who carried them out, learned the same lesson at the same time, that the system could not touch them, that witnesses would not hold, that evidence would evaporate, that you could kill people on the east side of Indianapolis and walk away. Eric Butler was inside that organization when that lesson was being written. He watched it happen in real time. He was charged in 2015 alongside 10 others, and the case against him fell apart in 2017. He watched Richard Grundy himself beat murder charges when a key witness was found to have lied about her own identity. He watched case after case collapse. And then he watched the federal government finally bring Grundy down in 2019 on drug charges, not murder, because they couldn't build a murder case that would stick. That is the world that shaped Eric Butler. A world where the courts were not a deterrent, where walking free wasn't luck. It was the expected outcome, and where the only accountability that ever actually arrived came not from a judge, not from a jury, but from the streets themselves. And here is the part that is genuinely terrifying, because it connects directly to Lil E's death in a way that nobody has said out loud. The Grundy crew's enemies never went away either. In July of 2017, Richard Grundy III was riding in a funeral procession on the northeast side of Indianapolis. The funeral for his 28-year-old cousin Jasmine Moore, who had been shot and killed outside a strip club 2 weeks earlier. As the procession approached Sutherland Park Cemetery, 3 men in a white pickup truck opened fire. At least 20 shell casings were recovered. Bullets struck homes and vehicles. 3 people were shot. Richard Grundy himself was hit multiple times. In the arm, the torso, the leg. He survived. Sources close to the investigation confirmed that at the time of that funeral ambush, Grundy had a $50,000 bounty on his head. $50,000. Placed there by his enemies. People who had decided that since the courts couldn't touch him, they would. He's hurt so many different families. It's just all kinds of people coming after this guy. One source told reporters, wherever they see him, they're going to shoot. A funeral procession. A horse-drawn carriage carrying a casket. Children hitting the ground. Mothers hitting the ground. 20 shell casings in the street. And Richard Grundy, the man the court spent years failing to convict, bleeding on the pavement at his own cousin's burial. That happened 9 years before Lil E was killed. in the same city, in the same ecosystem. And the enemies who put a $50,000 bounty on Grundy's head didn't disappear when Grundy went to federal prison in 2019. They redistributed their grievances for murders that were never prosecuted, for family members who were buried without justice. Those grievances didn't expire. Eric Butler was one of the people those grievances could find. Now let's connect this to something even more specific, because in that same 2017 period, the courts were working their way through the Grundy crew's co-defendants. One by one, they were cutting deals, pleading guilty, taking their time. 10 of the 11 co-defendants reached plea agreements. The one who didn't, the last one standing, the one still fighting, was Eric Butler. His case kept getting continued, keep getting delayed. While everyone around him was either pleading out or going to prison, Butler held on, and then the case collapsed, and he walked. When you're the last man standing in a major gang prosecution, the one who didn't plead, the one whose case fell apart, you become a very specific kind of figure in that world. You become someone who the system couldn't break, someone who the courts couldn't hold, someone who, from the outside, looks untouchable. And untouchable is a dangerous thing to look like, because it attracts two very different kinds of attention. It attracts a loyalty of people who see strength in survival, and it attracts a focus of people who interpret your survival as a provocation. Now here is a detail that has never appeared in any of our previous episodes, and it is one of the most disturbing pieces of this entire story. When Indiana State Police executed their search warrant on that East Washington Street house in September 2023, the raid where Lil E climbed out the attic window, while 14 other people ran out the front and back doors, the investigation that produced that warrant wasn't a quick operation. A confidential informant had been making controlled buys at that location over multiple days. And according to community sources who followed the case closely, those buys were conducted using marked money, federally marked currency, bills whose serial numbers were recorded before they were handed over, so that when the raid happened, investigators could trace exactly where the money went, who touched it, who held it. Let that sit for a moment. Eric Butler was being bought from with marked federal money. The bills in his hands were already evidence before he touched them. The state was building a paper trail around him in real time, and he either didn't know or couldn't stop, or had made the same calculation he'd always made, that he would survive the legal fight the same way he'd survived every other one. And he was right. Again, the jury acquitted him on every count in February 2025. Marked money, attic window, SWAT teams, Fox 59 cameras rolling, none of it was enough. Not guilty on dealing cocaine. Not guilty on dealing a narcotic. Not guilty on unlawful possession of firearm by a serious violent felon. He walked out of that courtroom in February. He was shot in April. He was killed in June. The marked money wasn't what got him. What got him came from a different direction, entirely. And here is where the secrets of this case run deepest. Because the house where Butler was arrested in 2023, the one where he climbed out the attic window, was described in court documents as a house connected to former drug kingpin Richard Grundy, not connected to a former associate, connected to Grundy himself, who by that point had been sitting in federal prison for 4 years serving a life sentence. For years after Grundy goes to prison for life, a house connected to him is still being used as a crack cocaine distribution point, marked federal money changing hands. A high-ranking crew member present and willing to go through the attic to avoid arrest. The organization didn't die when Grundy went to prison. It kept breathing in the same locations, through the same people, and the obligations and debts and territorial claims that existed inside, it kept accumulating interest. The community has told us across 3 previous episodes about 3 converging motives for Butler's death: a $750,000 debt connected to those supply chains, an alleged robbery of $200,000 to $250,000 in goods whose victim chose murder as a response, and a territorial threat to someone's position on the east side. But here's the 4th layer that none of our previous episodes named: the legacy of unaddressed grievances from the Grundy era itself. People who lost family members to that organization. People who watched murderers walk free for a decade. People who decided that if the courts wouldn't settle it, they would. Eric Butler walked out of courtrooms 4 times in 11 years. And every single time he walked, somewhere in Indianapolis, someone who had a reason to hate what he represented watched it happen. Now I want to tell you something about who Eric Butler was trying to become, because this is the secret inside the secret. The thing that makes this story not just terrifying, but genuinely heartbreaking. After his death, a question started circulating in the Indianapolis music community for words that went quietly viral among people who knew his work. Is Lil E the Lil Baby of Naptown? Meaning, was he the Indianapolis rapper with everything it takes to break nationally? The talent, the catalog, the authenticity, the fan base that 100,000 monthly Spotify listeners represents. Was he the one who just needed the right moment, the right alignment, the right deal to cross over from the city that claimed him to the country that hadn't yet discovered him? His people believed yes. His engineer, Drew, believed yes. The record deals reportedly on the table in the weeks before his death suggest people with money believed yes. And the album that most clearly captures who he was trying to be is the one whose title tells you everything. Eric Butler versus the state of Indiana. Not Lil E versus the state. Eric Butler, his real name, against the entire legal apparatus of the state he was born in. That title is not a joke. It's not just a reference to his criminal cases. It is a psychological declaration. It is a man planting his flag in the middle of a war the system started with him and saying, "My name is Eric Butler, and I am still here." He put the fight into the art. He made his survival the subject of his music. He named himself after his own persecution and turned it into a cultural identity that people chose to stream over 100,000 times a month. That is not the portrait of someone who doesn't understand what they're involved in. That is the portrait of someone who has decided that the confrontation with the law, with the streets, with the forces trying to end him, is what makes the story worth telling. And that walking away from the confrontation would make both the music and the man into something smaller than what they actually were. But here's what that album title also reveals. When your identity is built on opposition, when who you are is defined by what you survived and what you've beaten, leaving the world that built that identity doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like erasure. It feels like becoming nobody. And that psychological trap is one of the hardest things in the world to break free from, especially when the world you be leaving is the only world that ever made you feel like somebody worth remembering. Eric Butler was trying to become Lil E permanently, try and make the music identity so large, so real, so undeniable that it would finally outgrow the street identity that had kept him alive but was slowly closing in on him. The record deals were the door. The new music was the path. He was running toward something real. And somebody with a rifle decided he didn't get to reach it. The final piece. The one that should leave you unable to look away. The same pattern that killed Eric Butler has been repeating in Indianapolis for over a decade, and the courts have failed to stop it every single time. Jasmine Moore, shot dead outside a strip club in 2017. Her funeral ambushed with 20 rounds. Grundy shot in the procession. Unsolved. Tyrus Dorsey and William Davis, shot dead outside a convenience store in January 2014. The alleged hitman paid $12,000. Murder charges eventually dropped against Grundy. Unsolved. Julius Douglas and Carlos Jefferson, killed 3 days later. Allegedly murdered because they failed to kill someone. Unsolved. Mac Taylor, found dead in an alley, a known Grundy associate. Unsolved. Lorenzo Clark, murdered after surviving an earlier attempt. His killers, allegedly acting on Grundy's orders, also escaped conviction. Unsolved. Over and over and over again. The same corridor. The same world. The same silence. Over 20 bodies. 0 murder convictions. And now Eric Butler, the man who beat every legal case, who survived every attempt the courts made to hold him, who named an album after his fight with the state and won. Dead on South Franklin Road at 2:25 in the morning. Shot with a rifle with no arrest and no answer. The ATF reward line is still open. 1-888-ATF-TIPS. That's 1-888-283-8477. Email ATF tips at atf.gov. Crime Stoppers of Central Indiana takes anonymous tips at 317-262-8477. These families deserve what the official record has not yet delivered. What do you think? For motives converging on one man, a $750,000 debt, a robbery worth $250,000, a territorial threat, and a legacy of 20 unaddressed grievances from an organization the courts never fully dismantled. And behind all of it, a man who was being watched with marked federal money in September while simultaneously being told his biggest opportunities were still ahead of him. What does that tell you about the world Eric Butler was navigating? And what does it say about a justice system that linked over 20 murders to one organization and never once put anyone in prison for a single one of them? Drop it below. Subscribe to Mystora Crimes. We are not done with this story, because 20 bodies deserve better than silence, and so does the 21st.